Okay, welcome everybody to this second webinar. Just a few facts to start with. We put the SurveyMonkey out for this webinar to many people. We had 30 replies from 17 countries. It looked like pretty much you're all using the same costing methodology for next year as this year, and you're all on single year plans apart from Afghanistan, Brazil and Nepal. In terms of discussions around changing your costing methodologies, it was a kind of a three-way split. A third were having those discussions, a third were not, and a third weren't sure. And it also became apparent in recent days that there is significant overlap between these different costing methodologies, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. In terms of some of the challenges that some of you guys are having, Mariana in El Salvador talked about the challenges of defining a methodology to work out the 2021 HRP with OCHA. Philip and Dis in Somalia listed a range of challenges, which you can see there. Patrick, the coordinator in Syria, talked about limited standards for harmonized costing, fluid exchange rates, and a limited amount of knowledge with partners around different methodologies. And Ahmed in Yemen talked about the need to come up with a nationalized average, costing based on partners' experience, difficulties around agreeing standard cost per activity, and also relatedly prioritizing the activities, because that also affects your overall, your overall response plan. So we'll move now into a series of presentations. We're going to kick off with David Alford, who's currently the coordinator in Venezuela, and he'll be talking about the work he did some years ago in Palestine. So I'll hand the floor over to David and let him take it away. Let me just stop sharing here, turn off my camera. Over to David.
All right. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I've just shared in the chat a link to the file and the file itself. And what we're going to look at briefly is some of the pros and cons with a project-based costing methodology, how we got around some of those limitations in Palestine back in 2015, and from that experience, a few elements that, that we should be considering in our planning processes, whether it's a cost-based or project-based approach. To give a little bit of context and why Palestine and why 2015. It's simply an example I always go back to because it was quite illustrative, and because since then I've often taken the same basic Excel and adapted it to different purposes. So what are the pros with a project-based approach? It's really easy. You just export from HPC tools and you have your inputs for the HPC HRP plan. However, over the years, we've had a lot of criticisms of the consolidated appeals process, of the strategic response plans, and today of the humanitarian response plans. And quite often the perceptions of the critiques are essentially the projects are over budgeted, they're often unrealistic, and they don't necessarily form a coherent plan when you look at them all together inside of the HPC tools. And so in that sense, from the point of view of a sectoral response plan, the cons are that you can end up with a supply-driven approach, especially if you don't actually know what's in your plan. To do it well actually requires a bit of a bigger process to be able to identify and make sure that we're actually filling the geographic priorities and strategic priorities we have. And that can be really cumbersome to do well and very difficult to do in a fluid situation. And finally, to pull this off, we do need to have a decent revision and vetting process that often we have to fit into very condensed timeframes. If you guys are like us in Venezuela, we've got till the 20th and then 2 weeks to do a revision process. And quite often at this point, if you're identifying the geographic and strategic gaps, it can become a bit of a box ticking exercise. So If these are the things we need to fill for our HRP, these can be filled from HPC tools. But it's worth noting in Palestine, we were using these as our selection criteria. And as you can see, there are elements that are a little bit quantitative that can be pulled directly from HPC tools with a bit of manipulation to compare, and elements that require a qualitative review. Somebody actually has to read the project. So the first output we had from Palestine was a means to do that project review process in a structured way. So in the Excel, you have some basic metadata about the project, the selection criteria, and what was the SAG consensus for every one of the criteria, and the where we suggest we need an amendment, what kind of amendment, and other suggestions for improvement. And here also, as you can see, it's this easy, structured way also to gather comments from other clusters, and the fact that we're doing it all online this year means that this could be quite useful to keep outside of the system to keep a track of the review. So basically, why do it? It gives us a written record, but it also means that we can actually identify where we have those over budgeted projects or those unrealistic projects. And we can also identify common weaknesses amongst the various partners to be able to try to build that into our work planning for the subsequent year. What does it require? It means we need to have those selection criteria defined. We need to have a committee, and we need to have a process with a calendar that leaves enough time for the feedback and the adaptations. It also needs some basic data manipulation directly from the project-based database to be able to pull out some elements like the cost per beneficiary, etc. Some tips: make sure that everybody who's in the review committee has a common understanding of the criteria, and make sure that you split up the projects, because otherwise what tends to happen is everybody's read the first 10 and nobody's read the last 10 or however many. But you need to have one person who's read them all, basically, to be able to provide a common basis, a common frame of reference where various different people might have concentrated on some projects or another. And in that sense, the key thing is really consistency. Consistency in the marking, but also consistency in the application of the criteria, and also considering the time frames in the calendar for the process. The other output from Palestine that you'll see in the file is an attempt to understand what is our coverage geographically and of the strategic areas that we want to cover. In 2015, we were coming out of the 2014 war, where essentially a large part of infrastructure was destroyed along the eastern front, right up until the Saladin Road. And that included not only habitation, but also all of the water infrastructure and the various different systems that we put in over the years. We also had consistent issues with flooding areas that were persistently underserved. And in the West Bank, we were moving towards a transition to the Palestinian Authority coordination and working towards dealing with water scarcity and master planning in the Area C communities, because we were having challenges also with justifying the humanitarian elements in the West Bank. And so in that sense, for this area, for this year, it was really important to make the distinction between top priority, normal priority, or at least that was something that we were using back in those days, and to pull that out to be able to justify our allocations. To understand what was our allocations by strategic objective. Essentially 1 to 3 was the Gaza Strip following the war, and 4 and 5 was the West Bank. And as we can see here, relatively, we should have seen more towards the Gaza Strip. Also, in terms of areas of intervention, in terms of flooding, for example, these are what we had in the HRP. So you can notice, for those who know Gaza Strip, that the projects were focused in the south, with a couple of projects that gave some flexibility. And this was complemented by something outside of the HRP, which also covered middle area and Gaza proper. In terms of underserved, we see very little in 2015, but that makes sense because we were coming out of war. And so in terms of the war coverage or the war affected areas, on this basis that we're providing comments and suggestions to the projects that were in the HRP to fill some of the gaps that we could see. So why? We need to understand what's in the plan to be able to inform subsequent advocacy and also to inform our work planning to make sure that we're covering our geographic and strategic priorities. What does it require? It requires some data manipulations and also some manual analysis, because essentially to pull out the gaps, you often need to compare it to something else. And also there are some limitations with how the data is structured in HPC tools. You can go much further than some of the things that I've shown you, making maps, etc. But the key thing is to think about the analysis. Any gap analysis requires that comparison, and we need to promote the HRP projects. So also thinking about the audience, what are the kinds of mashups, what are the kind of messages that we want to promote? Some elements to consider. Let me go a little bit quicker. If we're trying to cover these things within the HRP process, it can be a real pain. It can be very cumbersome to do. We have limitations with the HPC tools. We have the possibility to do an additional process in WASH specifically, but the question is how much effort is actually worthwhile. And in that sense, some questions to consider. But at this stage, if we haven't done that, what we can do is make sure that we do the analysis to be able to think through what is our advocacy from here. How are we going to fill those geographic gaps, those strategic gaps? What are the audiences? What kind of advocacy in the traditional sense? What behavior changes do we need from different people? And how are we going to get to those? I'm sure I've gone a little bit longer than the last time. Questions? Over.
That's great, David. Thank you very much.
Can't question over here.
But yeah, go for it.
That was an amazing amount of useful information in a very little time. So definitely want to go over your presentation on my own. But if you can go to, I think it was slide number 2 or 3, right at the beginning of your presentation. I think you had a series forward, next one. You had an Excel sheet there. Forward, the next slide. Right here. SAC consensus on selection criteria. Okay, you've got here some considerations like priorities, needs assessment, technically feasible, monitoring and evaluation. These are massive chapters to address. Just wanted to ask you how much of all those parameters that you had to look into and agree with the SAG were done over the year as a running thing? How many were done, as we know, it's a protracted crisis. So maybe you've got the advantage of having been there for 8 years, I don't know, with a kind of similar running system, because most of these are obviously very important to take into account, but they're months work, isn't it? It's like a series of meetings with different people, approval for each of those. So I wanted to have your perspective on how feasible is that to be made to that degree of detail in, say, a sudden onset or an emergency that maybe has been running for 1 or 2 years. Sorry for the length of the question.
No worries, man. I mean, it's a valid point. And in reality, it was a simplified process. We don't dig down into the detail. And in reality also, in terms of the HRP projects, so the concept notes that are in the system, it's relatively hard to evaluate in detail some of these things. Nonetheless, what we were benefiting from was indeed a long history. In Palestine, we had the EWASH platform. I think that started in 2002, that ran until 2008 when we had CAS-led, and then the cluster appeared. This was 2014. Gaza is essentially a prison in a very large sense. And so we were able to benefit from the fact that we had a lot of the same people in the positions, who had established areas of interventions. And so some of that geographic positioning was taken care of to some degree by the prolonged nature, let's say, of the response. Nonetheless, for each of these ones, they could be evaluated. In terms of priority, for example, the cluster strategic objectives, do they align, yes or no? And with which ones? The priority, we had clearly defined what were our geographic priorities and intervention areas in line with PA policies, yes, Palestinian Authority policies. Needs assessment was essentially that some kind of needs assessment had been done. Local
At
partner,
whatever
yes,
point during that year, I
feasible.
imagine.
At some point during the year, and which informs essentially from the needs assessment, the good programming aspect was, does the programming actually address the issues identified in the needs assessment? And in terms of the good programming, also there you have all those elements of AAP, which can now be partially evaluated from HPC tools because of those questions about AAP. The technically feasible element was based on the fact that the guys in the SAG had a heck of a lot of experience and could see, had experience with what was feasible and also had experience with what were average costs per area. And in terms of our cost effectiveness, there we were looking at cost per beneficiary primarily. Right. And there I think there's, that is where we can use things that we have from the cost-based approach to inform a project-based approach, or this is some of the areas where the two overlap.
Yeah. This is the kind of overlap and mutuality that I mentioned earlier. Yeah. Thank you very much. And that's great. Any further questions for David at this stage? I'll take that as a no. So I'm now going to hand over to Ahad, the National Myanmar Coordinator, and over to his presentation on costing in Myanmar. Over to you, Ahad.
Hi, everyone. Good evening from Myanmar. Due to the bandwidth of the internet, I won't be opening the camera, but please feel free if there is something to stop me at any point. And I'd just like to elaborate more further on this presentation. This methodology has been used since a long time ago, 4 years so far. It used to be used by ex-colleagues that she was covering here as a National Watch Cluster Coordinator. Here, the approach is relying on a hybrid approach to HRP costing, which is a bit relying on the skills and the partners' feedback in terms of doing a costing per each geographical area, going to a very breakdown level to the details of states, township, and etc. So briefly about Myanmar, a cluster activated in 2018. It's a protracted crisis compounded by natural disaster in a way that the response is scattered in different states. The country is facing very challenging situation in terms of access and a lot of partners usually working in different states. So we are having, like as we can see in this slide, 3 geographical areas, mainly in the north, Kachin, and we are having Shein as well, north of Shein, which is usually the main actors there is local NGOs. And if we are talking about Rakhine, so most of the response has been led by the international NGOs. Here we are talking about northern of Rakhine. We are having villages plus the humanitarian rights challenges that most of the IDPs are facing. In the central of Rakhine, we are having like a camp and host communities. Kachin states in the north, it has like the camps and host communities. Shein as well, camps and host community, the same context, more or less similar to Kachin. Without going into the details, talking about the HRP, it's not a project-based. At that moment, we used to have like 35 partners. In 2020, we used to have as well 23 partners. We use the same costing methodology for 2021, and we are having 24 partners. As I mentioned, Rakhine is having international NGOs, Kachin and Shen, local NGOs, and INGOs working like in consortium. So this picture, based on my understanding, like has been captured from protracted camps, in which like a lot of sorry, this is not a protracted camp. It's one of the communities in which like they are having restrictions of movement, and you can see like it's a type of semi-permanent construction. You can see like most of the sites has been exposed to flood, a lot of stagnant water, a lot of semi permanent, let's say, infrastructure and MOSH facilities exist in this location. Going to the costing process, we are having the national WASH cluster develop template for partners to include their targets and costs. So based on this feedback or this matrix template shared with the partners, each partner is highlighting their proposed target plus the unit cost to cover the such kind of a certain package that's already agreed within the cluster. So what is our role as a cluster lead? As a cluster coordinator, we need to give them like the guidance, provide in writing in the templates, and present in the meeting, team available for bilateral support as well. We guide them like from the previous years, what is the standards that we are looking for, especially that we are having a different groups that we are targeting. So we are having IDPs, we are having returnees, resettled as well, stateless, which we are talking here about the Rohingya, and we are having a host community and other vulnerable crisis affected people. So the package is basically not very specific. However, we are having like the kind of a guidance on the package of the response. Partners usually fill in this matrix and they came up with estimated budget per beneficiaries, and I will move to the next slide so to explain further how we are doing like this breakdown of beneficiaries and type of projects. So in 2019 we used same methodology for 2020 and 21. We have the budget, which is including the operational costs. We are having the cluster costs and preparedness budget. Each partners, as I mentioned, gather or contribute and give the inputs at state level as an average cost per person per year based on the type. So if we are talking about IDPs, you will be having like a specific or proposed unit cost. If we are having the returnees or villages, so it varies, depends on the response and the package usually that the partners are planning to implement for the future. So it's optional whether the cost at township level or at state level is used per partner. We are having a split, the program and support cost to be able to justify and to be able as well to see what is the support cost and what is the percentage, as well as we need to be able to estimate the support cost required for operation and maintenance activities. 3 sub-budgets. We are having partners to submit their average cost per person per year with program and support cost breakdown to cover all WASH need meeting cluster standard in their states. As I mentioned in the first slides, that it's like a full hygiene kits, latrine design that we already agreed at cluster level and the technical working group, or the water supply, including the treatment, what type of intervention that they will be doing. Here we are having like a challenge as well. I won't call it as a challenge. I will call it as a limitation for the full exercise, that it doesn't give like a specific intervention and what is the partners will be doing in a specific camp. So it's just like an estimated figure or proposed figures to fill in into the HRP, and it reflects like the partners' willingness for the future in which area that they will be working. We are having the preparedness cost, which is usually 2% that we suggest. We are having the cluster coordination cost as well embedded within this analysis, which is 3% of overall operational cost. Usually this budget, we didn't share it with any of the cluster members. So we didn't share it with UNICEF, with OCHA, or just like all the information gathered by MIMI and stayed at MIMI. We just compile and give a P code for the partners. However, this one, even the P code is not shared with OCHA and with other cluster members, including UNICEF. Going back to the famous matrix that we are using. So as you can see in the first column B, we are having states. In the column C, we are having the township. And then we are requesting the agency to write down usually the name of their agency. And then here we are having like these 4 groups that I talk about: displaced person, non-displaced person, etc. So usually there are 4 targeted group. Excuse me. So column E is explaining like the IDPs. So partners here didn't fill any kind of information in the column E, since it's already something that reflected from the people in need, and this is a fixed target giving at township level, and partners, they cannot, this one is usually like this column is usually fixed. They cannot enter any information in this regard. Going to the column G, it gives like the partners how many beneficiaries he is planning to target in terms of displaced person. So tentative target, as I mentioned. And then we are having in column H, we are talking about the program cost, and in column I, we are talking about the support cost. Total of these costs is giving us like the cost in US dollar. And at the end, we compile the whole partners that they are working in the area. So if like many partners, different partners are working in the same township and their target already achieved the people in need, we stopped at the figures of giving people in need. We accumulate the target, the cost, but we are not accumulating the IDPs. So for example, we are having 100,000 IDPs in X township. So this 10,000, we count all the partners input until we reach like the 10,000. We didn't top up on these numbers because we don't want to have like targeted population higher than the people in need. However, we accumulate the cost that already reflected by the partner, assuming that some of the activities will be having a kind of complementary approach or having a different scope, since we are not having very specific activities, and in each township that we might be having a different camps.
Ayad, we've passed 10 minutes now, so if you could maybe try and wrap up.
Sorry, no, I thought I'm okay in terms of fun. So here we just like the last one, we are talking about like the states, township, IDPs, as I mentioned, like the 4 targeted group. As you can see, like we will be getting an averaging of the IDPs in each township. We will be having like as well like an averaging for the IDPs returnees after compiling all the partners' inputs, and we will be having other vulnerable crises. This one is the total average of all these numbers. So usually we share it as well with OCHA, and it gives us like an indicator in terms of we are doing averaging of this population. Here it's a reflection about like the states, going like zooming out. So we are having the states, the cost per beneficiaries per each different category, each group. And cost per, as I mentioned, like in each state, it gives us like much better information about how to communicate with partners, how to design our projects. If partners are exceeding during like submitting MHF proposal or something, we are questioning this budget. So it's an indicative budget, and usually it's submitted to many reviews as well. Next year, we might be changing the approach, adding additional activities. This year, we've been requested by OCHA to translate this budget. So, for example, for the IDP, for the sake of information, I don't know, I'm sure like I already passed the time, but just very quickly, for the IDPs, we mentioned like it's a purely humanitarian. For the IDPs returnees as well, it's a humanitarian without including the life-saving. Non-displaced stateless person here, we are talking about more kind of restoration, not a restoration, really restoration of service. And we are talking about temporary services that already above the level of life-saving. And the most other vulnerable crisis here, it's more community-based approach, which is like a light rehabilitation of water facilities in the existing latrines, hand pumps. So here the more focus on, let's say, a midterm intervention. That's all from my side. Thank you very much. I'm ready to answer any questions or queries. Thank you.
Ahad, thank you very much. And thanks for just highlighting now the importance of considering different beneficiary populations in terms of your costing approaches. Any questions from anyone on Ahad's presentation?
Sorry, I already stopped sharing the presentation.
That's okay. Any questions from anyone?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Philip.
Yeah. Just very quickly, I just want to understand the rationale behind having different costing package for the different groups, that is returnees, IDPs, and then displaced within the context of your country.
Yes, given the fact that this is the figures that given by the people in need, like reflected from the people in need given by OCHA and reviewed by the WASH cluster. So we prefer like to have a unit cost instead of having like beneficiaries. So since we already have this type of information, we go and dig deeper about the categorizing the intervention based on this population, since like a different package of response we need to consider it while we are budgeting for our activities and the HRP. I hope it's answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, an in-camp population would have a different budget structure to a host community, for example. Yeah.
Exactly, or villages, for example.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
Adrian.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
in French or in English? So yeah, I have a question in English. Our colleague did his presentation. So he's talking about the costing activities. So this approach, for me, I just want to know if they have modèle or est-ce qu'ils ont en fait une comment on appelle en fait quelque chose qui là où ils ont toutes les activités qui ont été comment dire calculées. Est-ce que ils ont par exemple nous chez nous on a ce qu'on appelle
we're, in terms of fiche de calcul, various spreadsheets have been mentioned so far. There will be others, and we will be sharing those. So if you've seen an Excel, you will be getting a copy of it to look at closely and modify as you wish.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Great. I think at this point we'll move on to presentation 3 from Alex, talking about her work in North East Syria. So if you could stop screen sharing it, that's lovely.
Yes.
Alex, I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Hello.
Alex, we can hear you. You just need
Okay.
to speak. You just need to speak now.
Can you see my screen or not yet?
I can see it. Yep.
Yeah,
Maybe
perfect.
if you can enlarge it
Yeah, sure.
to full screen. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so this presentation is a bit different. It's not exactly a costing methodology for HRP. It's mostly a rapid assessment, a cost assessment that we implemented in North East Syria, and it helped us to feed back to the COVID preparedness plan. So a bit of background for North East Syria. North East Syria is one of the 3 hubs in Syria. You can see it on the bottom map in yellow. It has a Kurdish self-administration, and there is no cluster mechanism there. Rather, was working group, which is also part of the NGO Forum coordination platform. North East Syria consists of 4 governorates with massive differences among them. For example, Deir el-Zor on the south is a more deserted area. Raqqa has plenty of water as it's close to Euphrates River, and Hasakeh, which is the biggest governorate, faces great challenges with water the last year. The local currency in Syria, the Syrian pound, had a lot of fluctuation the last year that led to great devaluation this summer. It was resulted from Turkey invasion, COVID-19 and US sanctions in Syria. Nevertheless, the local market is quite adequate, and most of WAS partners are procuring locally, mostly hygiene kits. At the WAS working group level, we had 12 to 20 partners reporting and coordinating during meetings, both INGOs and local NGOs. So during the revision of COVID-19 preparedness plan, we identified some activities that we wanted to capture, and we needed the costing. The same methodology could also be used to inform HRP, GHRP, country WAS response plans, or even contingency plans. So what we did was to consult with key partners to identify the core activities that were relevant to the context and to COVID-19, and to validate with different ongoing and planned projects. We wanted to capture the currency, if it was local or dollar, the unit where it was relevant, the origin, if it was procured locally or imported, to capture the difference between the 4 governorates or even districts. And then we designed the assessment and we launched it with a week deadline. We consolidated the data and we shared the analysis with different partners and the NES forum. So the core activities that we identified was the hygiene kits, core and top-up, COVID-19 kits, full and light, water tracking, workers' wage, solid waste collection, and dislodging. We could also include here the hand washing station, but we already had that information at our level. So for water tracking, we also included the water tracking source as the price differs. We captured the coordinates, price per cubic meter, and the currency. For workers, we decided to capture the daily workers' wage and the cash for WAS that was implemented by a couple of partners in informal sites. For hygiene kits, in NES, we had the standardized kit content decided by the technical working group and launched among partners. So that was included core hygiene kit and top-up hygiene kits. And then the COVID task force designed the standard COVID-19 kit, while some partners were distributing a light version with only some materials included. So here we captured the unit, price, currency, and the procurement if it was locally or imported. When we received all the data, we consolidated and we made the analysis per price per partner. So here is an example of the core hygiene kit price. We had 9 partners reporting, and we calculated the maximum price, minimum price, and the average price. The average price was the one which was used to fill and update the COVID-19 preparedness plan. For water tracking, as explained before, the price differs per water source. So 7 partners reported on the water tracking cost per water source per cubic meter of water tracked. The minimum cost, as expected, was in Raqqa Governorate. close to Euphrates River with $0.4 per cubic meter, while the maximum price was reported in Hasaki Governorate with water truck from boreholes, and it was $3 per cubic meter. The average price was $1.8 per cubic meter. So some pros and cons of this methodology. One of the pros is that you can support uninformed and tailored projects or different response plans. It supports to compare and analyze daily wages among partners, which can support the technical working group to a standardization of the wages. It gives an in-depth understanding of project budgets and can support on funding requirements projection and mainly on more emergency context. On the negative side, we had data sensitivity issues. We had many partners reluctant to share the name of the organization, even if we assured them that data would be kept anonymous at analysis level. This method is not always compatible with intersectoral strategy, and that was the case in North East Syria. If we use local currency in this methodology, then the data may differ and change over time, and it doesn't give a holistic overview of projects. Also, another negative side, it's in contexts like North East Syria, where we had massive rehabilitation projects. We cannot use that methodology as rehabilitation of water station pricing activities may differ per governorate or per scale. To wrap up, the unit cost methodology provided realistic data on which partners could base their project cost calculations. In North East Syria, project-based costing approach is used to prepare the HRP projects, while unit activity costing was used to inform the PRP for COVID-19. It was also very informative for non-WAS NGOs in order to prepare their project for COVID-19 WAS activities, such as provision of COVID kits or hygiene kits. And that was from me. Any questions?
Thanks very much, Alex. Any questions for Alex, please?
Since I was like in Syria and out of curiosity, and I know how to do it, but it just like to elaborate for more with the other colleagues that they are like having a different approach or having working in not only a context of camp. How do you like calculate the restoration for the restoration services in terms of all this estimation is based on camp intervention or let's say life saving? So how do you calculate as well like for kind of restoration, rehabilitation of existing water supply or sanitation in this area? Over from my side.
Yeah, as explained, we only use it for core emergency activities such as distribution of hygiene kits, water tracking, or salaries of daily workers. So for rehabilitation and long-term projects, we couldn't use that approach. It was mostly project-based costing.
Yeah, this issue came up on the last webinar where we had some colleagues from Syria on the call, and obviously this wouldn't be appropriate for, you know, all the work on the water treatment stations down the Euphrates River. So this was specifically for emergency response activities and preparedness activities, as Alex was explaining. But yeah, it's good to flag the different, you know, a camp and a water treatment station are very different in terms of costings. Any other questions from anyone?
Maybe I have a quick one regarding the currency. I'm speaking on behalf of South Sudan, where we work in the South Sudanese pounds, but also USD, and we have quite crazy inflation and deflation at the moment. I think in a couple of days it dropped and raised by around 400 SSP. So, and you mentioned this was also an issue for you. Would you have any recommendations on how to deal with that?
So for North East Syria, what came out from the assessment was that 90% of the partners are procuring on USD.
Okay.
So the fluctuation was not impacting WAS programs. It was impacting other sectors a lot, but for WAS it was not that serious.
Okay, well, that makes it easier, I guess. Thank you.
I mean, for example, we had a non-WAS NGO distributing hygiene kits. So they programmed with the Syrian pound currency, and because of the devaluation, they ended up procuring 20 times more hygiene kits than they had initially planned.
Oh, wow. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question, Olivia. Anyone else? Any other questions at this stage? I'll take that as a no. I'll now go into my presentation, well, Haitam's presentation about Zimbabwe. So just let me pull that up. Okay, so I'm giving a presentation on behalf of my colleague Haitam, who's an information manager in our field support team. He was deployed to Zimbabwe beginning of the year from January until July. And Haitam found himself sort of making the links between two response plans, the 2019 project-based HRP, which was based around drought and crop failure and other challenges, and the 2020 GHRP for the COVID-19 response. You'll see from this table that, sorry, I just need to do one thing. No, that's fine. You can all hear me okay, yeah? That's fine, good. So you can see from this table that the sector target between the two responses was very similar, 2.7, 2.78 million. But the challenges were, the HRP was very over budgeted. So you can see some very significant differences between the green figures and the yellow figures. And the challenge was to resolve that. And the approach involved a process of optimization for different specific activities like hygiene kits, hand washing stations, etc. This table shows the pre-optimized grid. So the rows are different types of coverage. So the top row is 0% coverage. The third row is the optimized range, which was achieving a target coverage of between 80 and 120%. But as you can see, pre-optimized, there were significant challenges with a lot of districts being under-targeted, and in fact, even more being over-targeted. So that was the challenge to be resolved. I won't get into all the details on the slide, but it did involve a process starting with the WASH COVID PIN, developing activities and indicators, setting targets per district for the different activities, selecting eligible partners to apply. There are 17 in Zimbabwe, developing standards and costings, and then getting this optimized percentage coverage rate organized. So this fairly busy slide, just to explain it, each row is a district and each column is a responding organization. So for example, in Bulawayo district, we had the MB Trust wanting to do 6,000 hygiene kits, UNICEF 1,000, which was a total of 7,000. That equated to a coverage rate of 50%. So under-targeted there. The total budget was here, and if you divide that by the partner hygiene kits total, that shook down to a unit cost of $15 per kit. So that was used as a cutoff. So any partner pitching in with a budget over that figure was reined in so as to avoid overspend. And that process was obviously an iterative one, but it meant that everybody knew what their hygiene kits should be costing. And that meant that the optimization process allowed costs to be minimized and targets to be optimized, not maximized, respecting the original 2.78 sector target. And it addressed the issue of, for example, partners being prone to choose easy to access districts like Harare and Bulawayo. And this approach allowed humanitarian need to be respected over agency agendas. And where there was over-targeting, the sector made contact with a relevant partner in order to bilaterally resolve. So having gone through this optimization process, it was $15 for a hygiene kit. It was just over $200 for a hygiene, for a hand washing station. It was much more complicated for healthcare centre WASH improvements because there were many more factors involved, and there were various challenges with assessing the healthcare facilities. But having done the optimization for hygiene kits and messaging, for example, we see here that now 45 districts are within that 80 to 120% range. That gave us a target of 138, but our cumulative target was 152. So now we're a bit over target, but we're not massively over target, which we were at the beginning of this story. The game-changing decision, which made things very challenging, was that at the 11th hour, UNICEF significantly reduced their number of partners. And this is the whole issue around a non-harmonized process between the UNICEF Humanitarian Action for Children and the OCHA GHRP process. So that decision by UNICEF meant that actually we went back to this situation of having these numbers of under-targeted districts, a very significant number. The over-targeting was addressed, but the under-targeting remained an issue. So now we had some very big differences between the target and the cumulative target. So I know Haitam could speak in even greater detail about the process. I won't. We had our colleagues from Zimbabwe on the last webinar, and Meki also flagged the challenge of just very limited time to do these processes with OCHA, very tight deadlines, and that really impacted on the opportunity to consult deeply with partners on the whole process. So that's Zimbabwe, courtesy of Haitam. Happy to take any questions as best I can at this point.
I have a comment rather than a question.
Either is good.
It's interesting to see in comparison with David's presentation, how in his case, many of the stuff that had to needed to be agreed, reached a consensus, had already been done over the previous years, whilst in the example that you're presenting, you are actually having to calculate the average cost of a hygiene kit for this specific exercise, which
Absolutely.
is something that traditionally falls under the whatever twig, be it the hygiene twig, be it the hygiene kit twig, if there's to be one. So I just wanted to highlight how incredibly different different contexts are. In your case, you had to come up with a cost of a hygiene kit that should have really have been done time before.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, very good point.
To like that, because I think it's
no,
quite
it's a very good point.
The challenges that we face.
There will be some no, thank you very much, Jean-Louis. That there will be some platforms where they have a long-standing data legacy where these numbers are known and all the issues are known. Other contexts, you've got to build it from the ground up, which was the case here, obviously. Plus the hyperinflation, significant needs, you know, different contexts, different challenges. But no, thanks for highlighting that. Any other questions at this stage?
Do you know why they chose to use a different approach in the GHRP?
I don't know the reasons for that, Ross. No.
It seems unnecessarily complicating.
Yeah, Haitam would be best placed to answer that query. Yeah, we can pin him down next week when he's back. Yeah. But the other parameter that was being used, so I understand, was that the target groups for COVID-19, they were targeting the over 60s and the under 18s. So that, and then they came up with various vulnerability criteria, which I didn't get into in this presentation. But I think all that contributed to them having to rejig the mathematics. Yeah. Okay, that's the last presentation. What we're now going to do is put you into breakout groups, which Olivia and Juan Louis will be chairing. So Rebecca and I will see you all again in about 15 minutes or so. when your breakout groups will conclude. So I think Rebecca's allocated you already, so you should all be being sent as I speak into your breakout groups.
Maybe just what they're supposed to discuss.
Sorry, I've got a slide for that. Sorry, yeah, just hang on. Here we go. Right, this should work. Can people see that?
Yes, it's clear.
There we go. So basically, the objective of the breakout groups is from what you know, from what you've experienced with your recent costing exercises that you're currently doing or have done, what you've learned from the webinar, where do you want to go from here with your individual platforms costings? What might you be doing differently in future? What specific support might you need to improve your costing? So it's a chance in two smaller groups to have a good chat about where you want to go with your platforms in terms of costings. I'll leave it there. See you guys in a bit.
So we've got some inputs from Myanmar and Yemen. We actually only had representatives of Myanmar, Yemen, and Central African Republic.
Yeah, that was deliberate. Yeah.
Shall I paste what I noted down?
Have we got everybody back? Is everybody back?
Yeah, it looks like it. Everyone's back.
Yeah, Juan Luis, if you want to take it away, could you just, before you start, could you just paste your bullets into the chat so we can all see them?
Yeah.
Brilliant. And do it to everyone. Yeah.
Let's see. Okay. So we've got comments of Myanmar at the top with the two people that were working there, Yemen next, and colleagues from Central African Republic. We didn't have time.
I can't see it in the chat yet.
I can see it, it's there.
Okay.
It's this thing on this side of the screen.
Yeah, I got it. Lovely. Yeah, no, it's okay. I've got it. Yeah.
Okay. So basically, in a nutshell, both Myanmar and Yemen highlighted the fact that OCHA has conditioned the way they are going to be calculating these figures for the coming years. So in both cases, I think it was Ahmed and Mimi pointed out that OCHA was requiring costing by activity plan for the coming years.
Right.
So more than, however, more practical or less practical each of the methodologies are, it's kind of been imposed from the OCHA side. So going into a bit more detail of what they mentioned, well, they were obviously, I mean, it was very helpful to see the different methodologies, which backs up the idea really that there's no one way of doing this. Obviously, different context, different amount of information that you might have is going to condition the way you solve the problem. There was another layer of categorization that colleagues from Myanmar mentioned, because they already had segregated their data by population profile, as they showed during the presentation, and by geographic area. And they also mentioned that short-term and long-term activities, because they involved activities that might change in the cost per unit per person, something like that. So that was another interesting variable that they added into the analysis.
Sure.
Yemen, they used activity-based methodology, fueled by what OCHA had requested them to do. And that's all I have, really.
Okay, no, that's very helpful. Certainly there is.
Sorry.
Yes.
To do your costing, you need to have the data you need to do your costing in terms of locations, populations, disaggregated, etc. So, good point. Any other comments from that group?
Adrian.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to add, because we didn't have more time, to develop, our strategy. So in CAR, we start early, just putting in place a twig, a technical working group on BOQ, bill of quantity. So we have already our document. So we have this document.
And because we have already put in place a tweak, and we discuss about the prices of all the activities and all the wash infrastructure.
Yeah.
And based on that,
twig. Yeah.
Exactly. And based on that, we share it to all partners to tell them that for each activities, this is the cost, and you have to evaluate the costs in the type of populations and in the by zone. So based on that, we ask OCHA colleague to share with us which zone is targeted. Then we define and we evaluate how much it will be costing for each activities.
Yeah, so I have already shared with you, with Ross, our document, our strategy, and just to add that the government in CAR, they approve, this document. So yeah, it's very, very good satisfaction for us. Thank you.
That's great. So you've got government approval on all this data and costing you've done. That's great, because once you've got your costing and your figures agreed, that process generates buy-in and ownership of the numbers of the process, and it's that collective strength which is really significant. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdul. Anyone else from Juan Luis' group? Sounds like a no. Olivia, sorry, Ross, have you got a query?
Well, I threw a couple of questions into the chat, which people can mull over and come back with. Because we didn't talk about what would be good to do
going
in
forward.
The future.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in knowing when would be the best time to have activity costing for next year. Because I think it's a bit late this year.
Yeah, we realise this is the first time for us, and this is a late webinar. We wanted to do it earlier, but we haven't. But it's the first time for everything. But yes, Ross's question is very valid. What's the best time of year to have this kind of event?
And the second one is I mean, it's useful having the overview, but maybe people are more interested in going through a sort of tutorial on one costing process. And if OCHA's squeezing everybody into activity costing, then maybe that's it. So just we can think about that as we move forward.
Sure, absolutely.
Following up on that point,
yeah,
if I may chip in, similarly to what colleagues in Central African Republic are doing, and Ross just mentioned about the timing, I know that in some cases, I'm looking back and thinking of Mozambique and Nigeria, where I worked, they had integrated price listing in their either standard operating framework or any of the other sector strategic documents. So that is already a start into this system. Actually, other countries might have been doing that already. In this case, Central African Republic mentioned that they did this ad hoc for this exercise, but that exercise might have been done already and included in any of the documents. The problem with that is that in the prices in the countries where price fluctuates, like the colleague was telling us about North East Syria, you need to constantly be revising that, and that is cumbersome. But yeah, just highlighting that.
It can be labor intensive, yeah, and you need resources to do that. Juan Luis, Ross, thank you both very much, and Abdul as well, and everyone in the first group. Olivia, over to you for the second group, please.
So maybe I can say that this also came up for us, that we would be interested in having this kind of a workshop again. Some of the dates suggested were around July, August, so that it's in a timely fashion. Yep. And the overall links between all the presentations, of course, that they were very useful, helpful, and that some of our different countries would like to be speaking to other different countries, seeing that they've already been able to implement strategies that these countries would like to use in the future. We're also a little short on time, so I'll just give a brief rundown of the different countries that presented. So for Ethiopia, they're using a unit cost approach per activity. And one of the challenges that they're facing at the moment is that they're using this costing that was developed a couple of years ago. And so to mitigate the different costs that have occurred over the previous couple of years, they've developed a technical working group to revise the unit cost. Another interesting point for them was that other countries are involving SAGs and having a more in-depth consultation with SAGs and cluster members. For them, that could be slightly problematic due to the time constraints that they face in Ethiopia. As I said, they want to pick up from good practices from other countries. Palestine was mentioned as one of them. And another overall thing we discussed in our different groups was the interactions with the cash working group and with the joint market monitoring systems. For them in Ethiopia, it's only just started, but it expects to pick up in 2021 a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, one issue at this point is the increasing use of market-based cash approaches, and obviously those cash-based or voucher-based programming modalities for watch service delivery will impact on your budget and your costings. Yeah, so thanks for mentioning that.
Okay, great, thank you. I'll touch very briefly on Syria. Our colleague there mentioned that she's no longer with the team, but just wanted to flag as well that the cash working group also captures water trucking prices and that they were primarily a project-based approach in the past. And they did have market-based surveys in the past in the north of the country, but lost it due to conflict and the group working there being displaced.
Sure. Yeah, moving back to a bill. Yeah. Yeah.
Then final three countries. The first was Somalia. They were using a hybrid. No, sorry, they found the hybrid costing very interesting, and they'd like to be discussing that with colleagues who have done it. They're doing project costing at the present time. And one of the issues they face is that it's a very diverse countries. The response plans found in different parts of the countries, the needs found in different parts of the countries differ quite greatly. They have a core pipeline, so it's not that their costing would center entirely around the items as in other countries for hygiene kits, despite some organizations may be funding their own supplies. Rather, it would be looking at infrastructure development and software programming as well, such as hygiene promotion. For Venezuela, they are doing a project-based approach. One of the key issues that they're facing in Venezuela is that prices are difficult to track down. This also stems from the inflation due to everything, I guess. I don't remember the exact inflation rates you mentioned, David, but they seem to be quite extreme from when you arrived to the present time. And then they were the presentation that talked about the price monitoring initiative with the cash working group, specifically that they are able to track the prices of hygiene kits and different elements related to water. Even if they're not using it at this point for their HRP, it is interesting to get the different perceptions and the prices of the vendors and the agents throughout the country. And it would be interesting for other clusters to also have a look at these different price differences. For South Sudan, I didn't write it down because we ran out of time, but I can say briefly that we did project-based in the past and we'll be doing it also this year. And much like the countries from Group 1, we have been instructed by OCHA to change our methodology in the following years. They did try to ask us to change it this time, but the clusters pushed back, citing time limitations. For us, we also have a similar approach as Somalia does. We have a core pipeline, so a lot of the costing wouldn't stem from the items, rather for infrastructure and also software development. And that's a quick wrap.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I appreciate it was a bit of a time-pressured exercise, but thanks for capturing all these issues. That's really helpful.
Excuse me.
Yes, Ibrahim.
Yeah. Here also in Yemen, we already conduct.
Ibrahim, yeah, sorry, go ahead. My My mistake. I meant to ask others in the group, but no, go ahead.
Okay.
Over to you,
Okay.
Ibrahim. Thank you.
Okay, in Yemen, we already also conduct cash for wolves technical working group, and it's already finalized the guidance and tools, and we will try to conduct a pilot project next year. Over.
Understood. No, that's interesting to hear that. Thank you. Any further comments from anyone? Sounds like we're done. Thank you all very much indeed for participating, all your contributions, all your thoughts. We will be sharing recordings of the 2 webinars and the information from the chat boxes and the PowerPoints and the Excels. So all the materials you've seen and the text you've seen, you will be getting that. I imagine it'll be sometime next week rather than this week. If you've got any specific, but we'll get those materials to you as soon as we can. We just need to cross a few practical hurdles. Sorry, I'm trying to turn on the video. But thank you all very much for participating. If you've got any specific items you want to raise with myself or Rebecca, please reach out. Very happy to support you and guide you as best we can. But I think this is a kind of first round of getting platforms talking to each other that are having similar challenges to support us all moving forward on effective costing for a sector that's very underfunded and with an increasing number of people that need cost-effective, well-budgeted, realistic wash service delivery. So thank you all very much.
I have a quick question, Adrian.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Abdul.
Amadou, okay.
Amadou, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. So after this webinar, so at your level, so can you maybe recommend one of, I don't know if you can recommend, you know, what one of the 2 approach or the 3 approach we have seen today. So do you have a recommendation for it? For us, for example, in Central Africa, we are using, you know, the cost activities. So in other countries, they are using another approach. So at the global level, so what you can recommend?
At the global level, we can't recommend any specific methodology. The motivation behind this webinar and the one on Tuesday was to basically get everyone involved to have a greater understanding of what the challenges are, what the options are, the pros and cons of each methodology, so that you can make a decision locally as to what works best for your context. We wouldn't want to say you should do this. We want to support you in what's best for where you are. Over.